I'm Alisha Babbstein, the archivist here at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I'm joined today by our Curator of Collections, LeVant Prahl, and Judy Margles, the director of the museum. And we're here today again to share with you some of our fun and favorite interesting clips from the collection, the oral history collection. And we're specifically focusing on work and business today. And just to note, this is really the tiniest slice of what we have in terms of folks talking about the work they did and the businesses that they owned. There really are hundreds of stories. So we're really just showing you a small handful of them today. And we probably will only make it up through the Depression also. And as always, you have the great benefit of Judy and Anne here to guide you through that history. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we wanted to let you know that some of the clips are a little harder to hear than others. We've done our best to clean them up. Many of these were recorded in the 70s and the recordings are not always optimal. So some are quieter and some are louder than others. Sometimes there's some back noise. So we have our volume turned up at the highest to share. So you may need to adjust your volume up and down as we go as the clips start to play. And just a quick reminder, the Q&A is always open. So we like to use the chat for comments, and we like to use the Q&A for folks who have questions that they'd like us to answer or get to at the end. So please use both of those forums if you feel up to it. And I believe without any further ado, I will go ahead and move us into our first section, which is we'll be discussing peddlers, and Judy's going to talk about that. So I'm going to move on and we'll go ahead and play a clip first, and then Judy will go ahead and give you some background.
Actually, if you don't mind, Alisha, I'll do a little background first, and then
Sure.
I'll ask you to play the clip. Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here. I was just going to say a very little, just some introductory comments about, this opportunity to talk about work. We're going to begin, I think, quite naturally with peddlers. Alisha in a second is just going to read two quotes. But, what we know, of course, is that in the 19th century, there were thousands of Jewish men and women who fled Central Europe. They were unable to make a living in Europe. They were unable to get married. They were really unable to raise a family. So starting in the mid-19th century, thousands of these people were fleeing Central Europe, moving to the United States. They had this hunch that they could do all these things that they were unable to do in their home countries and more. And that led them to spread all over the United States. The population swelled to about 250,000 by 1880. And by 1924, there was another wave of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe and Russia that brought an additional 2.5 million Jews to America. So really the question we're exploring today through our oral histories is, how did Jews make a living when they arrived here? We're going to start with the peddler, but let's listen, and for that, let's listen to Rose Olds.
Because my father couldn't read or write, he became a peddler right away. But this is interesting. When he would go out and sell his junk, he couldn't see the scale. He couldn't read it. But when he would come home, and they had pretty good memories, and Mom always had beans. We always had beans. So he would take a handful and sit down at our kitchen table, which was the center of everything. And the beans would be his addition. That's the way he would add, because he couldn't have a pencil like you can and write.
So, this is just one of a number of oral histories in our collection about Jewish settlers who began as peddlers, right? And when you think about it, what did peddling do for these early Jewish immigrants? It was the starting point, right? Peddler doesn't have to pay rent for a shop. They don't have to fill out a job application. They don't even have to speak English, right? So these people arrived, they couldn't speak English. This was a way to get them started. What do? They walk streets. They show people their wares, they negotiate prices. And in Rosa's father's case, he had to sort of learn even how to do that kind of negotiation. They can't, if they couldn't afford a cart, as we're going to hear in a minute, they would pack everything they could carry in a pack and carry it. So there were young Jewish men working the area around Portland, and some traveled throughout Oregon hawking dry goods. So what did they peddle? Secondhand clothing, cooking utensils, jewelry, notions, scrap metal. And I'm actually quite curious if any of you have come from a background where you know that your father, your great-grandfather, your grandfather, anybody was a peddler in your family, go ahead and put it in the chat. We'd love to know that that you have that history and where that history is from. And of course, peddlers provided a really valuable service in these growing West Coast communities. There weren't many stores. Peddlers could go around and sell items that the settlers needed. People couldn't always go out and buy new things, unfortunately, in this pandemic. That sounds all too familiar to us. Wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a peddler wandering around now helping us out? So instead, they used items. People in their homes would use items for as long as they could. Peddlers helped recycle things. They took away the buttons and the metal that they could use over and over again. And of course, a few peddlers succeeded handsomely, the proverbial rags to riches story. So let's just go ahead. Alicia's going to read the second quote.
I had no money to buy a horse or wagon, so I started in the junk business in Astoria and was my own horse and wagon. I bought old sacks, brass and copper, old iron and bottles, and carried them on my back until I got as much as I could carry.
So of course, this is Sam Schnitzer. I think that's a name known to all of us. Sam fled the Russian army in 1903. He had a brief stint in New York, came to Portland, got some work in a tobacco store, got enough money, and then headed to Astoria, where he began peddling junk, right? He was peddling bottles, sacks, scrap iron, usable steel. He did that for about 3 years. Then he moved back to Portland, formed the Alaska Junk Company, which is the photograph on the right in the image. He had a horse, he had a wagon, he built the company until he could buy complete sawmills, logging camps, shipyards, and he was able to ship junk and machinery all over the world. So today, as again, I'm sure you know, Schnitzer, it's a global leader in metals recycling. I'll just say about Sam Schnitzer, which I love this quote, and I love that in 1935, he was interviewed in the Oregonian, and I can't help but think there was some kind of ironical sensibility running through his head when he said, and it's sort of the continuation of this quote, really, he says, I don't carry old iron and junk on my back anymore. Nowadays, we ship it in carloads or train load lots. So as I said, he was wildly successful, not necessarily the norm. These peddlers, eventually, they settled down. Some expanded into Oregon's more remote areas by importing goods from San Francisco or New York and sending their younger relatives to towns all over the state to open general stores. So I'm just going to pass it over to Anne, who's going to tell you a little bit more about towns across the state.
We're going to hear the quote first.
I can read Nathan first.
Why don't we?
My father was the pioneering type. He saw no future in the sweatshops of New York City. After he moved to Portland, he made his living by hauling baggage in his wagon from the railroad station. In Eugene, Essie traded in wild animal hides bought from the trappers in the Willamette Valley and wool fleece, cow hides, raw chitin bark, and an extract from grapefruit, both horribly tasting laxatives, and secondhand equipment.
I love it when they describe, that's the best thing about having these interviews that were taped in the 70s, because the memory that they're talking about goes back so far. Because we didn't get to meet the people who actually traded in wild animal hides and traded with trappers. When they first came, these young men from Central Europe, mostly from Prussia and Bavaria, spread out all over the state. They spread out all over the Oregon territories. They were entrepreneurs. They were ready to branch out for themselves. They were ready to live a life that was not filled with oppression. And not all, I think most of them started out as peddlers, but peddling led to 3 branches of jobs. Some of them went from peddling merchandise to manufacturing, from peddling old clothing to manufacturing clothing, or tents and awnings and other soft goods. Some of them went from peddling and stayed in retail and became retailers, and some of them became wholesalers. And all over the state, certainly throughout the Willamette Valley, in Jacksonville, in Southern Oregon, in Eastern Oregon, we're going to have some clips from Baker, and along the coast, there were Jewish stores. There were little Jewish mercantiles who were selling all over this state, and there were these little stores. Essie, the father of Nathan Rubinstein, who's just talking, left Poland and came to New York to trade in all of these wild west things, and settled and stayed in Eugene. I don't know how versed the audience is with businesses in Oregon, but that was Rubinstein Furniture, which was certainly a major enterprise still when I got here 30 years ago. All right, let's move on.
Would you like me to play the clip?
Yeah, we're going to hear Sanford.
No, I never panned for gold. Then we would canvass in Prairie City or John Day, and in the evenings while we'd have dances, and Leo would stay home and watch the jewelry while I went out and danced with some of the girls. and he was too long in some of these houses where he'd go to solicit subscriptions for the Saturday Evening Post, which he represented, and his pockets was full of silver dollars. Those were before the times they used paper dollars, and we all both did well. And that's when the Edison phonograph came out with the cylinder records. It was quite a fad those days, and then it developed in the disc records, and I would carry phonographs in the back seat. And we made good sales. In fact, we did more business on the road than we did in Baker.
I don't know if you could hear the very first thing he says. He's answering a question that she must have asked him. He says, "No, I never panned for gold." And I just love that, because certainly they were the right time and place to have panned for gold. And throughout Sanford's interview and the interview with his brother Leo, they talk about the gold mines, and they talk about the miners coming into Baker. And so we know the mines that were around there, and we know that it was a mining town. They were not miners, and I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Judy and Alisha, but I don't think we have any record in interview or in history of Jews mining. Really, what these young men did, they saw the opportunity, just like the gold rush people did. They saw the opportunity out here, but what they saw is the opportunity we call mining the miners. And they followed the miners from Southern Oregon all the way up. I saw Jewish-owned businesses in Helena, Montana when I was up there not too long ago. They sold the things that miners needed in their mercantiles. They sold the pans and the Levi jeans and the cooking utensils that the miners needed.
And of course, it was not an Oregon story, but a familiar story that it was Levi Strauss, and Anne mentioned Levi jeans, but of course it was Levi Strauss who went to Northern California, as Anne used the expression, to mine the miners. He understood that they were getting holes in their pants because they were constantly on their knees. So he created this kind of very durable denim. So that's probably the most famous story of a Jew working successfully in a business.
Now, Leo and Sanford Adler were kind of unusual as far as the Jewish story in Eastern Oregon goes, because really in the mid-30s, most of the Jews in the outlying towns in Oregon had moved to the cities. There was still a community in Eugene, and there were Jews in Salem, but the general migration story is that that between the wars, most of the Jews ended up in Portland, whether because of business opportunities or some of the women who grew up in Eastern Oregon tell the story that their parents moved when they became teenagers so that they would meet Jewish boys and not date the local boys. And some moved to just to have community. Sanford and Leo stayed and ran the Baker News Agency. Leo's house is a museum in Baker right now. And for these interviews, Shirley Tanzer went out to Baker and met with them in their homes to talk to them. And they walked her around and showed her what had been. This is a picture of Sam O Bottling Works, which is another Baker business. Let's just skip it. Let's just skip Sam O. We don't have, Sam O was a soft drink bottling business, and it was Sam Ottenheimer was Sam O, and more like the rest of his contemporaries. He left Baker City, but his nephews stayed and ran the Sam O Bottling Works. And I believe that there's still the swimming pool in Baker City today that is the Sam O swimming pool.
Alicia, if you would play the next quote then. Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, he had his difficulties with learning English. He always retained a kind of an accent. People sort of call him Charles Boyer. He had sort of a European flair and accent. But the rest of the family, my Aunt Adele, who had Adele's Restaurant, which was a kind of a famous restaurant in Portland for years because it was European. All the artists ate there. And I got to even meet some of them because they were so friendly with her. But she and my other aunt retained a very strong Russian accent, which my father criticized them for because he wanted them to be more assimilated, more American.
So, we wanted to keep the first part of that quote in there because this idea of assimilating and coming to this country, particularly the Eastern European and Russian Jews, had these very heavy accents. I actually think we could do an entire program about learning in English and losing accents because, again, the oral histories have many, many stories. So this is not an unfamiliar story about you need to lose your accent to become American. Adele's, I don't know whether you can see in the slide, the name of the restaurant is actually just behind her upper left corner. In fact, again, in the chat, I really appreciate the comments coming into the chat. If you remember Adele's, it closed in 1960, so it is a stretch, but if you happen to remember Adele's, put it in the chat. So indeed, as the quote indicates, Adele Nussbaum, that was her last name, she was Russian. She'd arrived with her two brothers in 1914, opened the restaurant the following year. It was at Southwest Park and Southwest 8th, so right downtown. And it really had a reputation to be a gathering place for the local Jewish community. They were famous for their Russian delicacies. And they were also just sort of known as a place to help assimilate newcomer. Apparently people also went there to celebrate the Jewish holidays. And if you think about it, I mean, today that seems so foreign to us that we would go to a restaurant for assimilation, welcoming Jewish holidays. But if you think about it, what would have been available to the Jewish community at that time for social gatherings, there really wasn't a lot. There was the neighborhood house. It was the settlement house that provided opportunities for new immigrants to learn English, sew, cook, take citizenship classes, etc. And there was the Jewish Community Center. It had opened in 1914 at Southwest Mill and Market Streets. But really, it took a few decades before the Eastern European and Russian Jews were welcomed there. So we really can understand how Adele's became the kind of the living room of the Jewish community. So Alicia, if you would play the next quote, since we are talking about work, we thought that bringing up the somewhat indelicate subject of prostitution was important. So fair warning.
A huge gathering of people. It's kind of a terrible story. My dad had a man named Schimmel Rosenkrantz who worked for him. He was a huge guy. And Eddie Sammons, who was president of the U.S. Bank, used to eat there a lot. And there was also a guy named Jockey Rosen, and they called him Jockey because he had a lot of girls. Oh. And so Schimmel would come out and he'd say, "Where else but in Leonard's could you find a pimp sitting next to the president of the U.S. Bank?" And everybody would roar. My dad had just stools. He originally had booze and stools, and my mother and her friends would come in and spend an hour and a half having lunch, and Joe the chef got angry because there'd be people standing in line and all. So they took out the booze and put in more stools.
Now, having effectively gotten rid of all the women, Leonard's was called Leonard's because it was two partners. One was Leonard Kaufman Sr. and the other, I don't remember his first name, but his last name was Leonard. And the Mr. Leonard had, so it was a cigar shop. So all along this diner, all along one wall of the diner were the cigars, and then no booths, but card tables in the back and the stools up at the bar. It was a gritty place. My favorite thing was to sit with Leonard Kaufman Jr., the man who you just heard talking. He was talking about his father's business. To hear him talk about growing up in this really, really gritty 1930s and early 40s Portland. There's a picture of it there. One of my favorite anecdotes that he told was his grandfather, Isaac Kaufman, came up from San Francisco. I'm not going to remember when, just after the turn of the century, I think, in the first decades of the 20th century. And he had a business distributing liquor, and it was, as Leonard would describe it, it put him in close contact with the underbelly of the city. He dealt with the bars and the brothels and the gambling houses. And when it came time for his son, Leonard Kaufman Sr., to be old enough to work, Isaac sold that business because he didn't want his son involved in something as unseemly as liquor distribution. So Leonard went into gambling instead and ran this diner and gambling house. I think we are ready to hear about the Opera House.
Would you like me to read it, Judy, or would you like to speak first?
If you would read it. Thanks, Alisha.
Arnie Davis would make his rounds with Buck the horse, picking up soiled clothes from both the rich customers in the Heights and the brothels downtown. They were all over town at that time, and they had clothes, linens, and towels just like everyone else. As far as we were concerned, they had clothes to be cleaned, and we took care of them.
Gotta love it. So you can see, so the Opera House Laundry was opened in 1887. It was at Southwest Alder. And you can see that on that photograph. It wasn't originally a Jewish-owned business. 1900, J.J. Davis purchased the business, moved it in the 1920s to where Lanzhou Garden is today. That's the Chinese garden at Southwest 3rd and Flanders, just around the corner from us. And actually, I always love that they took an original brick from the Old Town Laundry, and it's buried. They had a special ceremony and buried it in one of the ponds in the Chinese garden, so it's still there. But back to what seems to be my favorite subject, and you ducked it quite well, prostitution. But it really was an accepted part of downtown life. And we know this in a couple of ways. We know it because we have, there's evidence, there are books about brothels in Portland written. Wealthy real estate owners, investors, they owned the properties on which the brothels were located. So it was a good business for them. And in addition to the quote that Alisha read, we have more than a few mention of brothels in the oral history collection. Harold Hirsch, he was the great nephew of Aaron and Jeanette Meyer, Aaron Meyer being the founder of Meyer and Frank. He recalled that the department store, Meyer and Frank, considered prostitutes among the most reliable customers because they always paid in cash. And we even have material in our collection about a female Madame Blanche Kay. So I'll pass it back to Anne to talk about Israel Boxer, and I won't talk about prostitutes anymore.
I'll go ahead and read Israel as well. He unfortunately, he has a fabulous Yiddish accent, but he's just very hard to hear in his interview. So we'll just go ahead and read this clip as well. To get a job here, you had to work on Shabbos. I couldn't work on Shabbos. And on Shabbos, I had to go to shul. All my life I did, and I wouldn't give it up. When I came here, it was a hardship. You had to be strong like the Bible says, or you would go meshuggah.
I love Israel Boxer. We have a large collection of Israel Boxer's items in the archives. In addition to running this business that he chose to do so that he could be as religious as he wanted to be, he ran a synagogue out of his home in Seaside all summer long. He had the place where anybody who was vacationing in Seaside could come and have services. And we have his prayer books from there and his Torah cloths and mantles from Seaside. It was a difficulty for all of the Jews who came from Europe to Oregon to deal with how much they were going to assimilate, how much they were going to stay within their own small community. But for a smaller number, there was the question of religion, and many of the people who we have recorded had to work on Saturdays, first because they were often traveling, they were often on the road on Saturdays, and second because they couldn't compete in business if they weren't open and selling on Saturdays. But for others like Israel Boxer, they managed to make it work. He was selling furniture and eventually restaurant supplies that he sold. All right, let's move to
Meyer and Frank.
Meyer and Frank.
You could play the quote, Alisha. Thank you.
Abe Meyer, who met everybody at the door. He would meet you at the door, and he knew whether you were a sharp trader or a pushover. And after having said hello to you very politely and calling you by your name, he would then yell to the back of the store, let's say to my father, "Max, Mrs. Tanzer's here. Take her down the middle aisle and show her the wood stove. She's interested in a new wood stove." Well, take her down the middle aisle meant, look, she's a sharp cookie, and watch your buttons, kid, when you trade with her. But if you said, take her down the left-hand aisle, that meant she was a pushover. Take her down the left-hand aisle and show her the wood stoves. They had all these signals worked out.
I love it. The funny thing about this story, Fanny, Mrs. Tanzer was Fanny Tanzer, and that she was the mom to Herschel Tanzer, who was married to Shirley Tanzer, who started this oral history project. And her other son, Jake Tanzer, he was on our board for a number of years. Jake, you might remember, he served on the Oregon Supreme Court. He was also one of the people who marched in Mississippi in the 1960s. Anyways, I asked Jake about his seemingly very tough mother, and he just was dumbfounded. Apparently, Fanny Tanzer was under 5 feet tall and not very tough at all. So this description is quite brilliant. But of course, Harold Hirsch is talking about Meyer and Frank, one of the most important department stores that emerged in Portland. Abe Meyer, who he's talking about, is the father of Julius Meyer. Julius Meyer was the first Jewish governor of Oregon, became governor in 1930. Aaron Meyer's story, Aaron, the founder of Meyer and Frank, is another genuine rags to riches pioneer. He came from Bavaria. He started as a peddler in the Oregon Territory before opening the first store. It was a dry goods store on Front Avenue in 1857. At that time, Portland, there were about 1,300 residents in Portland. But Portland started to boom in the 1860s. Anne mentioned the mines. There were new mining fields opening all over the interior of the state. There was a lot of money flowing through Portland because of that. And that really gave Aaron Meyer an opportunity to expand his business. It also made him much more visible and vulnerable to some deep-seated anti-Semitism, much less of an issue in Portland itself, but became evidenced in reports that the R.G. Dunn and Co. issued. R.G. Dunn was the predecessor of Dun & Bradstreet. If you are familiar with the credit rating service today, the Dunn was one of the first, I think it was the first credit rating service in the United States. And what would happen is correspondents would travel to communities and they would prepare handwritten credit reports on individuals and firms, and they would routinely submit reports about Jewish merchants, and many from Oregon, and they were just replete with negative stereotypes. So about Aaron Meyer, the report noted, A. Meyer, here 8 years, is a Jew, hardworking and attentive, not looked upon as honest, middle-aged, of only fair business character. Or there's another one I have to share with you about a cigar store owner, Henry Rosenfeld. And of Henry Rosenfeld, the report said that he is, quote, he's still addicted to playing poker and neglects his business at all times for this amusement, and by common consent is very successful at cards. So they were pretty nasty, these reports that came out. But just back, I'll just say one more thing about Meyer and Frank. You know, of course, the department store heralded 19th century urbanization in the United States, right? And so it was really this commercial as well as social and cultural phenomenon in Portland too. Jews were at the forefront of the establishment of department stores, again in Portland, all over the country. And Meyer and Frank was arguably the state's best known department store. It operated for more than 150 years and it closed in 2006. So Alicia, would you play this set? We have two quotes from Harold Hirsch because he's so articulate. Thank you.
You've got to remember that that sportswear is the product of democracy, in that it's the clothing that is worn for leisure and active sports. And by the way, White Stag is in the active sportswear business as contrasted to the leisure sportswear business. There's a difference. Active sportswear is just what the name implies: skiing, hunting, fishing, golf, tennis, swimming, and so forth, as contrasted to leisure sportswear, which is a more sedentary type of apparel, and apparel designed for more sedentary sports, such as sitting around the patio or going for a slow walk or cooking a hamburger over the barbecue when you're at home.
One thing I should mention, you know, many of the buildings that are in the photographs we're showing are taken down. They're not standing anymore. This building, of course, is still standing. It is where the University of Oregon is, where it's Northwest Davis and I believe 3rd. So it is still a beautiful building, recently renovated to become part of University of Oregon, well worth looking at. But back in the day when Max and Leopold Hirsch, they were the first buyers. They purchased the Willamette Tent and Awning Company in 1907. And it wasn't until after the First World War they changed the name to Hirsch Weiss. So the company manufactured tents, awnings, and actually some very unique products that were used here. They manufactured horse covers that protected draft horses from the rain. They also manufactured turkey saddles, which protected female turkeys from being scratched during the mating season. And we know this for sure because the Oregon Historical Society actually has one of these turkey saddles, and we borrowed it years ago and put it in an exhibition. The company also held the patent for the canvas water bags that they used to refill radiators of cars crossing the desert. But it was really the climate here in the Pacific Northwest that launched the company into work clothing. And it developed rainproof work pants and jackets called tin pants and tin coats, which they made by dipping the garments into paraffin. And the clothes stood up on the floor by themselves when the weather was cold. Can you imagine? So, and then of course, in the 1920s, the company became the White Stag, right? Very.
Can I add a little bit about White Stag there?
Please.
Yes?
Yeah, please do.
It was Harold Hirsch who went off to one of the Ivy Leagues. I think he was at Dartmouth, and learned how to ski and ski. Well, he skied in Portland, but he became quite a skier at Dartmouth, and he skied on the ski team and became a self-proclaimed expert in what skiers needed to wear. And he came back, and it was the very beginning of the Depression. And he told his father that he was not going back to school, but he was going to go into sportswear. And his father gave him a corner of Hirsch Weiss, and he called his enterprise White Stag, because I don't know if there are Yiddish speakers out there or German speakers in the audience, but Hirsch Weiss translates to White Stag. So Hirsch Weiss was still running while White Stag began, and then Harold turned that into the larger company.
Exactly. Thank you, Anne. That's good. That's good. So we're gonna go back to we're gonna stay in Portland, but we're gonna move to South Portland, and just to make that point again about the direction we've kind of been going. So the Central Europeans, the Central European Jews, as you might gather, they integrated very quickly. They moved to smaller towns across the state. But these first generation European, Eastern European and Russian Jews, they remained this very close-knit community. Very few left Portland until the next generation. So back to you for the quote, and Anne.
I'll go ahead and play David Finkelstein. This he happens to be one that's tough to hear, so just bear with us.
Most of some businesses, even in South Portland, there was people who had a little store, a little grocery store, or a little second-hand store, and then some of them headed up in Northport on Foy Street. There was all way up to Morrison Street. There was Solomon's had a store on First and Morrison. The Weinstein's brothers had a store on First and Young Mill, a big store. Rosenstein had a clothing store on First and Taylor Street, where Goodwill Industry used to be there in that building. And there was all kinds of small stores. And on the north end, on Thursday, the town, it was a wide open town when I came here. It was wide open, prostitution and saloons, all of them. And there was a saloon downstairs and a house upstairs, where there was women.
Yeah.
And some people, you come in, they had a little store, and there was just a little merchandise, maybe $30, $40 for those stuff. The whole thing, secondhand, a pair of pliers, a screwdriver, a hammer, or something like that. This was on 3rd Street.
I love his description. I've always wanted to create a South Portland diorama for the museum, because so many of the interviews, the people go street by street, not just the businesses that are on the street, but who lived on which corner and which synagogue was where. We have a map of the entire neighborhood. As was pretty clear from his description here, South Portland was a little self-contained universe. People didn't need to leave there to shop. They didn't need to leave there to go to school or to see their neighbors. They really didn't have to leave South Portland if they chose not to. And this was a difference. These were the Eastern European Jews who settled in South Portland, markedly different from their Central European predecessors, because they, while they shared the same goals of doing well and making a better life for their children and getting away from a horrible circumstance in Europe, they actively chose not to disseminate into the greater city, but to live together in community as they had done in Europe. And they built these buildings. William Toll, the historian from the University of Oregon, talks about the kinship ties of these businesses that, and the Germans had it too, where they would create family networks, a little sub-economy where manufacturers would supply and retailers would sell, and then the wholesalers in between. And South Portland was very closely connected in that way. The picture that's up on the screen is one of my favorites, and it looks like Eliana Fromer has commented and said that this is her great grandparents. Callistro and Halprin was a different kind of a connection. This was the neighborhood wasn't entirely Jewish. It was an immigrant neighborhood, and it had several different groups of people in it. This grocery store, Delicatessen, was the product of an Italian and Jewish enterprise, and the two families owned and ran it together. Although it was kosher, says so right there on the glass. And this photo was taken by one of our community members as well. This is a Bill Galen photo, isn't it, Judy?
Which photo?
Jerry Robinson. We have several great Jewish photographers who were amateur photographers in the 40s and 50s, and this is one of them. And here is
us. And I said, Louis, how did you know? He said I wasn't the Schnitzer Shabbos going for nothing. And then proceeded to tell what to me is the best South Portland story in the world. His mother was a widow, and she always baked her own bread. But she would sit in Moser's bakery to buy baker's yeast. And Mr. Moser would always go to the back of the store and then yell, Louis only steal 2 cookies. And then he would come out with a bag of, a sweet roast baked goods. Tell your mother she should do me a favor. These are day old, I can't sell them. She should take them.
Well, I certainly hope that you were reading along with that because Shirley is so very hard to hear. Donna Jackson is so very hard to hear in that clip. We really did try to get it to be as loud as we could, but the crux of it is the goodness of people to each other and the giving. Tell your mother that she would do me a favor. These sweet rolls are a day old and I can't sell them. She should take them. So everybody gets to save face, and Mosler gets to give away his baked goods to somebody who needs them. There are many stories of people helping each other before and during the Depression. One of my favorites is the story of Hannah Robison, for whom our Robison, help me.
Jewish home.
The Robison Jewish Home is named. Hannah lived in South Portland, and the story is that everyone could see her on Friday afternoons leaving her house with 2 shopping bags, and one bag was filled with things that people needed for their Shabbos meal and for the week to come, and the other bag was empty, and she would knock on each door and nobody could see if you were putting in or taking out something from Hannah's bags, and she would make her way around the neighborhood in such a way as to not embarrass anybody who needed help. Many stories about South. Sorry, go ahead, Judy.
I was just going to say one more story about Mr. Mosler, which I love. I had an opportunity to interview his daughter, Jessie Overbeck, again at Robison a number of years back. And it turned out to be shortly before she died. And I went in there with one challenge. I was going to leave with the bagel recipe, because all the stories, so many stories in our archive are about the deliciousness of his bagels. And then when I had to sort of gently probe her to see how I would ask this question. And then when I asked the question, she just laughed and laughed and laughed, because he carried his recipe to the grave.
Would you like me to read Nathan?
Please do. Nathan Schwartz.
We had marvelous times. We did not know of any anger or discrimination. We lived in a neighborhood where Italians were across the street alongside of Jewish people. Mr. H.B. Noodleman and his brother owned a kosher meat market on the corner of First and Sheridan. It was a very lively neighborhood. At 7 o'clock at night, everybody, weather permitting, would get out and walk the streets between Sheridan and Sherman, and the mamas would do their shopping at Halperin's Grocery, LeVant's Fish Market, and the Star Bakery. The drugstore was owned by a gentleman by the name of Miller and later by Leviton. Corson had a grocery store and Wolf had his barbershop. Across the street from Wolf's barbershop was a pool room, which we all gathered around. On the corner, we used to go to the movies at First and Grant, owned by a man by the name of Wittenberg and later sold out to Mr. Berg. On the corner of First and Grant was the Robison dry goods store.
Again, such a great description. One of our favorite descriptions of the neighborhood is of a man describing himself as a very small boy on a tricycle, I think, leaving his own house, and as he passes each neighbor, business or home, they call his mother to say, "He just passed my house. He's just fine." So everyone looked after everyone else. I don't have much more to add to Nathan. I thought he described it just well.
If you would just, play Alan Zell and all.
My father used to say, "You're Jewish because you help other people."
That's very succinct. So we're just, we just wanted to take a little pause and think about these Jewish merchants and these Jewish newcomers. And it's this phrase, I think we sort of came up with it a number of years ago with the help of Craig Wallner, one of our early mentors and a historian who was so wise and helpful about Oregon Jewish history. And I think he coined this word, doing well by doing good, or at least he gave us this phrase. And really to unpack it, these Jewish settlers, they did well economically, but it wasn't, social mobility wasn't necessarily forthcoming for them. I talked a little bit ago about, the Dunn reports and this sort of visceral anti-Semitism. What the community encountered was much more nuanced, but what they did to counteract it was develop their own economic network to help new arrivals take root. So they wanted, helping was really important. So there were organizations like the First Benevolent Association, giving loans to start businesses. But then there was this idea of how do you climb up the social ladder? And I don't want to suggest that it was sort of crass and calculated, but if we recall that the German Jews and the Russian Jews came from circumstances in Europe where they were prevented from doing things. So they came here really longing for a civil society, longing for law and order. And their way of achieving that was to give back too. So this doing well by doing good. What did these Jewish merchants do? Some of them went into politics. We know, for example, the first mayor of Portland, Bernard Goldsmith, he became the first mayor of Portland in 1869. He was followed by another Jewish mayor, Philip Wasserman. Both came from mercantile backgrounds. There were many instances of Jews going into politics. We have these stories. There was a fire in 1874 in downtown Portland. We know that part of the volunteer fire brigade were Jews helping to put out the fire. So this idea of contributing to the community as a way to achieve acceptance. So I'll just pass it to Anne or to Alisha.
The Benevolent Aid Society had funds to pay for the big thing. As a matter of fact, one young man came to one day, and when my dad talked to him, he said, "You look too bright, you speak too intelligently to be tramping around." He said, "I left home." And he said, "Where did you come from?" And he said, "From Chicago." Mentioned the name of the business. That was his father's, this ranching young man. And the name was familiar to my dad through business. And he said to this young man, "If I get you the railroad fare home, will you go back home, go back to your dad and go to work?" And the young man said, "I might." And about 20 years later, my dad walked into that business and that young man is now the executive. And my dad said, if for no other reason but that I got that one man on the right track, the society was worth it.
He's talking, of course, about the Hebrew Benevolent Aid Society, which he started. He was one of the founding members of. The man that she is talking about is her father, Nathan Director, who embodies more than anybody that I can think of in the community, this ideal of you're Jewish because you help people. Nathan had a business, and all of his brothers were successful in business as well, but he referred to his business as a hobby. And he said that his business, that other people see making a living as a means toward a loftier end, working as making a living, he saw making a living as a means to a loftier end, whereby he could fund his charitable giving as long as he went to work. And that was why Nathan went to work. He wasn't just a philanthropist himself, but he was one of those people that everybody knew why he was coming in their door when he came in their door. He was collecting for the Hebrew school. He was collecting for the Benevolent Aid Society. He was collecting for this or that synagogue, not just one. And I think every community has one like that. That when he retired, the program from his event called him the grand old man of the community. Judy, I'm turning it back to you. You know what? I don't even know that we can talk about the Depression, Judy. We might have to start our next presentation with the Depression because it's 5 minutes to 1.
Oh, I can.
I think we should take a few questions and do the 20s and on at another time. No?
That's fine.
We have consensus. There were a couple of questions I saw go by. Can you go back to the picture of Meyer and Franklish? Because Linda wanted to know if that was water in front of Meyer and Frank, and I don't think we talked about that photograph at all. It is indeed water, Linda. That is the 1894 flood. It was a regular occurrence before 1895 when they built the what was it, flood wall. They built a flood wall in the river. It was a regular occurrence for the water to rise, but 1894 was a particularly huge flood. Lots of pictures of businesses with their workers in boats rowing down the street in 1894. I'm going to look for other questions too. Oh, Judy, do you know why he named the company the Alaska Junk Company in Astoria?
I don't know, but I'm willing to take a guess. I suspect that in those days, Alaska was just the romanticism that would have surrounded Alaska at that time might have been a reason to just put that name in the title. But I don't have an accurate answer to that question. I've never read anything about why he chose Alaska. So total guesswork on my part.
Okay, so Judy answered that. I don't see other questions. If you have other questions, go ahead and type them, or if I've missed them, let me know where they were. Nope. Well, then I think that we can wish you a good day and let you know that we are doing this again on February 25th. So we hope you'll come back. We are really enjoying digging through our oral history interviews and finding these clips and talking about them. The three of us have terrific meetings where we have to decide what gets to stay and what has to go from these talks, because really we want to play you all of them.
February 25th, we're going to talk about synagogues and rabbis. And I will just, we have a lot of interesting stories about the rabbis in this community that we'll hope to share with you.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for joining us today.